So have you ever had a really bad day? This is a story that came years ago from a Florida newspaper. How true it is, I don't know, but it's a fun story. A man was working on his motorcycle on his patio, and his wife was in the house in the kitchen. The man was racing the engine on the motorcycle, and somehow it slipped into gear. The man, still holding the handlebars, was dragged through the glass patio door and, along with the motorcycle, dumped on the floor inside his house. The wife, hearing the crash, ran into the dining room and found her husband lying on the floor, cut and bleeding, the motorcycle lying next to him and the patio door shattered. The wife ran to the phone and summoned an ambulance. Because they lived on a large hill, the wife went down several long steps to direct the paramedics to her husband. After the ambulance arrived and transported the husband to the hospital, the wife uprighted the motorcycle and pulled it outside. Seeing that gas had spilled on the floor, the wife obtained some paper towels, blotted the gasoline, and threw the towels in the toilet. The husband was treated at the hospital and was released to come home. After arriving home, he looked at the shattered patio door and the damage done to his motorcycle, and he became despondent. And he went into the bathroom and sat on the toilet to smoke a cigarette. After finishing the cigarette, he flipped it between his legs into the toilet bowl while still seated. The wife, who was in the kitchen, heard the loud explosion and her husband screaming. She ran into the bathroom and found her husband lying on the floor. His trousers had been blown away, and he was suffering burns on his bottom and the back of his legs. The wife again ran to the phone and called the ambulance. The same ambulance crew arrived and was dispatched and arrived, and the wife met them at the bottom of the stairs. The paramedics loaded the husband on the stretcher and began carrying him down the street. While they were going down the long stairs, to the street, accompanied by the wife, one of the paramedics said, "How did he burn himself?" She told them the whole story, and they started laughing so hard they tipped the stretcher and dumped the husband out. He fell down the remaining steps and broke his arm. Now, that is a bad day. Like I said, it's a fun story. You laugh at somebody's expense, I guess. I don't know how true it is, but sometimes we just have those days when things are as bad as we think they could be, and they just get worse. We're going to look today at a guy who had a really bad day. And we're going to look at somebody else who was supposed to have a really bad day and didn't. And what I want you to see through this is that in all the details of our lives, even in what appears to be really bad days, God is in control. And God controls the details of our lives, and we're going to see that in the story that we're looking at. We've been looking at the story of Esther for a number of weeks. This is week 5. There's one more to go. Next week on Thanksgiving weekend, we're going to end this series. And just a brief review of the story. You remember that King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as his Hebrew name is in the Bible, most powerful man in the world in his day, disposed of his queen Vashti, his beautiful queen, and he and his men put together a beauty pageant to find a replacement for her. And the winner of that pageant was a Jewish orphan who we know as Esther. And she became a queen in the Persian realm. Not long after that, the king raised to power a man named Haman who hated the Jewish people. And Haman put together this plan of genocide, really to wipe out the entire race of Jewish people. And he tricked the king into signing it into law, so things seemed to be going bad for the Jewish people. Last week we saw how Esther, who nobody in the palace knew who she was, knew that she was a Jew, approached the king, even though it was against the law, and approached him very boldly to ask for her life and the life of her people. And last week, after she approached him and he gave her freedom to speak, she simply said, "Come to a banquet that I've prepared." And so the king and Haman came to Esther's banquet. And at that banquet, she invited them to a banquet the next day and promised the king that I'll tell you what's on my heart tomorrow if you come to another banquet. And I told you last week that the first 4 chapters of this book of Esther cover 9 years of time. But the next 4 chapters cover 24 hours. And so we're in for a wild ride as we work through these next 4 chapters to see what happened in the 24 hours between the end of Esther's banquet on day one and the end of Esther's banquet on day two. And it's quite a ride, so hang on, and we're just going to walk through the story and show you about it. It's a story that tells us a whole lot about Haman. Remember, he's the enemy of the Jews. It's a story that tells us a whole lot about that, but it's really a story that's all about God. And that's what I hope you can see today. Even though God isn't mentioned, this is a story that's simply all about God and what he is doing. So let's just jump into the story about Haman. It's really about Haman's big head. And that's what we want to think about to begin with. Esther 5, beginning in verse 9. Haman went out that day, that is immediately after Esther's first banquet, joyful and glad of heart. It says later he went home, and in verse 11, to his wife and his friends, he recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions which with the king had honored him, how he had advanced him above all the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me and the king come to the feast that she had prepared. And tomorrow we get to go to another feast, and she's only invited the two of us. You hear what Haman's doing. Haman is all about Haman. It's all arrogance. Look at me. Look at what the king has done. Look at all the honors he's given me. Look at how he's advanced me. Look at the power I have. And look at the fact that Queen Esther had a banquet and only the king and I got to go. It's all about Haman. He's completely full of himself. Keep that in mind as we go through this story, because that plays into the story a number of times. But he's like Mick Jagger. He can't get no satisfaction. Even this completely full of himself. It says in verse 9, when he left the banquet, joyful and full of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. And then he got home and he recounted all these deeds and how wonderful he was to his wife and to his servants. And then he says in verse 13, yet all of this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Remember, Mordecai would not bow down to Haman like Haman was requiring everybody else to do. And he refused to do it. And so that's actually what spurred the plan to wipe out the entire Jewish people, because he knew that's why Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And so his wife makes a suggestion. And this brings up the next point, Haman's big hangar. I don't mean a place where you put an airplane. This is spelled a little different. This is something you hang people on. That kind of hangar. She says in verse 14, his wife and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go joyfully to the feast. And the idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Okay, make a gallows to hang Mordecai. Now, don't think of an Old West gallows with a big frame and a rope that they put around his neck. Think of a long pole with a sharp point on it. And what they did, this is the precursor to crucifixion. And this is what the Persian Empire did for a miserable death. They actually impaled somebody right up the middle of their body with a pole and hung that pole up where everybody could see them. That's the kind of death that we're talking about here. It's an ugly thing. And so when they say gallows, don't necessarily think of what we think of from our Old West movies as gallows. Think of that kind of thing. And the size of it is utterly ridiculous. In fact, that Haman so easily agrees to this kind of shows you where his heart is. You know, life doesn't matter to him. The only life that matters is his. And if Mordecai's in the way of his advancement, he's going to get rid of Mordecai. And he's going to do it in an exaggerated way. 50 cubits high, 75 feet tall. 75 feet tall. That's crazy. Now, a lot of the interpreters and many conservative ones say that's really an exaggeration. 50 cubits is just a round size for meaning very big. It could mean that. Persian royalty always did things to the extreme. And so however big this was, it was extreme. He really wanted to make a spectacle out of Mordecai. And so this is going to be where everybody can see. In fact, some of the interpreters said the 75 feet, the 50 cubits, means he was building it on top of his house, so it was 50 cubits above the ground. The whole point is he was making a spectacle of it. It was so big, everybody in the city was going to see it. And that was the point of his doing this, this huge, huge thing to hang him on. Mordecai's life expectancy went from 11 months to 11 hours. Now, that's a bad day. I don't know if he knew it. We will see that a lot of people in town knew exactly what was being built and why. But we don't know if Mordecai did or not. But it was a bad day. But everything's about to change because in spite of that, God is still in control. And everything changes in chapter 6, and it begins with these words. On that night, the king could not sleep. The king's insomnia was what we want to talk about. He couldn't sleep that night. Now, some people have said he was so curious about Esther putting him off twice when he offered her up to half his kingdom that he was pondering what in the world could be so important that she's taking so long to ask me for it. And that's possible. Some people think that he was just generally worried about the kingdom. I mean, this is the most powerful guy in the world, and he ruled a kingdom that was gigantic. And some people think, well, it's just the worry of a kingdom. Some people, and I think this is funny, some people said he was kept up all night because he could hear hammers pounding outside his window as Haman's servants were building this humongous gallows. And so we don't know why, but he's awake, and the whole story changes at that point. In fact, what he does is he asks for the chronicles of his reign to be brought in and read to him. He's probably thinking a monotonous voice reading to me will put me to sleep. Listen to chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written, now remember, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I told you to take a little detail that happened in the story and store it away in a spot in your mind. That detail was that Mordecai had saved the king's life by uncovering an assassination attempt. And it was written in the Chronicles, and it was forgotten. And I said, don't forget that little fact, because it becomes important. Here's where it comes into play. It was found written how Mordecai had told about two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. That's where they get in the Chronicles. That, this Mordecai who sits in your gate saved your life by exposing this assassination attempt. And the king said, what honor or distinction has bestowed on Mordecai for this? He's awake enough that he interrupts the story and he goes, wait a minute. I don't remember anything. I don't remember the fallout from this. What sort of honor was Mordecai given? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Nothing has been done. And so the king is pondering that. And this king, as we learn in history, had a lot of enemies. He didn't need any more enemies. He didn't need people who were saving his life forgotten. He needed them honored. So he had no more enemies. And so fully awake now, he says, wait a minute, we need to right this wrong. If nothing was done to honor him, we need to do something to honor him. And they told him, well, nothing had been done. And so he asks a question. He says, who's in my court right now that can give me some advice? Look at verse 4. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared. Mordecai is up very early in the morning, first crack of gray dawn, because he wants to be the first one to get an audience with the king, because he's coming in to ask about Mordecai and whether or not he can hang Mordecai on his gallows. He gets there, and he's immediately called into the king's presence. Now, remember Mordecai, he's all about himself. And I'm sure what's running through Mordecai's mind is, this is a good sign. The king is up, he's receiving me immediately. We can get this deed taken care of. This is good for my cause. It's so ironic that both men were thinking of the same guy. Both these very powerful men were thinking about the same guy. One wanted to honor him and one wanted to kill him. And neither one knows what the other is thinking. But of course, when you come into a king's presence, the king always speaks first. And so Haman comes in to the king's presence, and the king speaks first. And he says to Haman, what should be done, verse 6, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, there's a good question. The king's looking for some advice, what to do with Mordecai. And he just says, what should I do with a man that I want to honor? And Haman expresses his desire. Remember, he's all about himself. Next verse. Haman said to himself, who would the king like to delight and honor more than me? So this is what he does. This is what I want you to do. Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse which the king has ridden, and on whose head is a royal crown. Probably the horse, not him, but anyway, a royal crown on the horse. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to the king's most noble official. And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so notice that this isn't about wealth. Haman had lots of that. It isn't about power. Haman had as much of that as he could get, short of being the king. This is all about Haman. This is all about being noticed. This is all about people seeing who I am and how important I am. And that's the answer that Haman gives. This is what I want, and it's probably going to be me, so I'm going to tell him what I want. But then, verse 10, comes Haman's big horror. Just big horror, number one. And so, an iconic Christmas horror picture is on your screen. Verse 10. The king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse that you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits in the king's gate. Whoa. I don't know if he saw Haman's reaction to that. But the man he came in to ask permission to kill, he has to go out and march around the streets and proclaim that he is the one that the king is honoring. And what follows, is Haman's big humiliation. Don't you like all those H's? Haman's big humiliation. One commentator said, this is an in-your-face assignment. The king didn't know about the feud between Haman and Mordecai. He didn't know what people Haman had convinced him to put to death. He thought it was a small group of people. He was never told it was a Jewish people. He didn't know much about it except what Haman had said. He doesn't know this feud between Mordecai and Haman, and yet he has to go out there and proclaim, this is the man the king honors. A lot of people in the city knew about the feud, because it was so evident when Mordecai wouldn't bow down and Haman would get so angry. Everybody in the city knew the decree against the Jews. And so they probably had an idea of what was going on. So this was indeed an in-your-face assignment. This is not a slice of humble pie. This is choking the whole thing down. I mean, this is utterly humiliating. And yet that's what Haman is told to do. The man he wanted to kill, he's now marching around the street proclaiming how wonderful he is. By the way, Haman's family doesn't make things any easier. He gets done, he goes home embarrassed, he tells his wife and his servants what's going on, and this is what they said to him. This is prophetic, actually. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Those are real comforting words, aren't they? Well, that's the start of your downfall. A lot of comfort in that. That's prophetic. I don't know if one of his advisors or his wife realized how God had protected the Jewish people through so much through history, whether they saw that or what, I don't know. But they didn't offer him any comfort at all. They just said, well, that's your downfall. Maybe they were tired of his boasting too. I don't know why they reacted that way, but they did. But Haman really had no time to ponder it whatsoever, because right after that, it's time for banquet number 2. And you'll see in chapter 6, verse 14, it says, while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. And then chapter 7, so the king and Haman went to the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again asked Esther, what is your request, Queen Esther? And so for the third time, they're at the banquet, the third time, the king says, what's your request? I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom. We talked about what that phrase meant last week. And this time she had promised to tell him. And so this is Esther's defining moment. This may be the moment for which she was created, as Mordecai reminded her in our message last week. This is it. And she makes a very simple request. Verse 3 of chapter 7. She says, the queen answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted to me for my wish, and my people for my request. 3 times he said, what's your wish? Twice she put him off, and she said, this is my request. Save my life. That's my request. And by the way, save the life of all of my people as well. And then she goes on to explain it in verse 4. We have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If those 3 words sound familiar, they should. Because those are the exact 3 words that Haman put into the edict that he wrote and sent out to all the kingdom, that the Jews should be destroyed and killed and annihilated. Exact 3 words that she uses. She says, if we had been sold merely as slaves, I wouldn't have bothered the king. And then the king asks an interesting question. He says, who is this that sold you and your people? Now stop there for a minute before she gives an answer and ponder what might be in Haman's mind. Now, some of the interpreters say that when she said those 3 words, he began to figure out what was going on. I don't think he did. Remember, this is a guy who's so full of himself he can't think of anything else. I don't think he made that connection at all. In fact, what I imagine was on his brain was this: who better to root out the king's enemies and put them to death than me? This is why Esther invited me to the banquet, because that's going to be my job, to find this enemy and destroy him. I'm good at that. I've already done that with the Jewish people. That's what's running through his mind. It's no wonder I'm at this banquet with no one else but the king. And then, if he hadn't had a bad enough day, Haman's big horror, number 2. I think he was listening with really great interest when she said these words. Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And it says Haman was terrified before the king and queen. I imagine if you watched him, you could just see the color of his face go like this. From a nice olive color to a very pale gray. When suddenly he realized who Esther was and why she had made a request for her life. He'd been humiliated enough in the morning, but he's probably thinking, I'm still at the queen's banquet, I'm still okay with the king, and it's going to turn out right, even with Mordecai in the end anyway. But this was the knockout blow. This is where he realized his life was in danger. Again, he suddenly realized who Esther was and the mistake that he had made. If that wasn't enough, it gets worse. The king is so angry, he walks out to his garden to take a little walk and blow some steam off before he decides what to do. And so Haman, taking advantage of the opportunity, being alone with Esther, falls down at her couch where she's reclining. Remember, these ancients often had their banquets and feasts while they were reclining on a couch. And while she's reclining there, he's falling down in front of the couch, begging for his life from her. Right at that moment is when the king comes back in. Chapter 7, verse 7. The king arose from his wrath, from the wine drinking and everything else, and he went out to the garden. It says he returned from the palace garden to the place where they'd been drinking wine, and Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. So you imagine what he sees when he comes back in. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence and in my own house? And as soon as the words left his mouth, they covered his face. It's been tradition in a lot of cultures. If somebody has a death sentence, they put a bag or something over their head to carry out that death sentence. And so they knew that Haman's life had been forfeited. And so the servants who were there covered his head, knowing that his life was over. And suddenly the tables are turned. Look at verse 9. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, a gallows that Haman prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on it. Can you imagine the king's double take when this eunuch who's standing there says, oh, by the way, there's this gallows in Mordecai's yard. He made it, or in Haman's yard. He made it for Mordecai. He was going to put him to death today. Can you imagine the king's double take on that? Like, what did you just say? And it's no wonder he said, just take Haman and hang him on his own gallows. Harbona's suggestion isn't a suggestion, it's just a little piece of information. But a clear suggestion is implied that that's what he should do. That's pretty brave for a king's eunuch to suggest something like that. Maybe he was tired of the boasting too. We don't know. But maybe. Just a quick summary of what happened after that in chapter 8. The first thing the king does is he takes Haman's property, and in many cultures in the past, it was the norm for if someone was accused of treason for their property to go to whoever they committed treason against, usually a king or somebody like that. And so the king immediately took hold of Haman's property and gave it to Esther, who put it in charge of Mordecai. It's one thing the king did. The next thing he did is he took his signet ring that he had given to Haman and he gave it to Mordecai. He said, you are now second in command. I know you're a trusted servant. And so Mordecai went from death sentence to second in command in the kingdom with the king's signet ring. The third thing that happened is Esther approached the king again and said, now what can we do about this wicked decree of Haman's? And the king was quick to remind her that we really can't do anything about it because it's been a law for centuries that anything sealed by the king's seal in the kingdoms of Persia and Media is a law that can never be changed. But he said, you have my signet ring, do what you think best. And so Mordecai and Esther were able to put together a law that would allow the Jewish people on the day they were to be killed to arm themselves, to protect themselves against anyone who was out to hurt them, and to even kill those who were out to hurt them. And so they made that decree for the Jews to protect themselves. Boy, a lot happens in 24 hours, doesn't it? What I want you to see is all the coincidences, particularly in chapter 6, but throughout this whole story. Not one thing that I mention here is miraculous. Not one thing is unbelievable in itself. None of these events are. They're pretty normal things. But when taken all together with their timing, it is an utterly amazing story. So think about these coincidences. Why was Haman so bothered on this particular day? Haman had been bothered by Mordecai this whole story. Why was he so bothered on this day he decided to do something about it? Who made the suggestion for a gallows? Why? And why was it such a huge showing? Why did all that happen now? Why was he in such a hurry to have those gallows built overnight instead of doing the normal thing and building them the next day? Really, that first question is, why was it this day that everything boiled over in Haman's mind? Why on this day did that happen? Another line of questioning is, what kept the king awake? We kind of teased about it being nail pounding or curiosity about Esther. What kept the king awake? This is the high point of the book. I'd never thought about this till it was pointed out by a number of different commentators. There's 5 chapters, and then this one phrase, that night the king could not sleep, and then 5 chapters. Everything in the book hinges on that phrase. And everything that happens because of that phrase. That night, the king could not sleep. Why do you think the king was awake? Last week I told you the people all the Jews in Susa were praying, and one thing they were praying is for the king's heart. Remember I told you King Solomon had said years before, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. The Lord turns it wherever he wishes. And that's exactly what was happening here. He was staying awake. Third question, why did he ask for the chronicles? Think about that for a second. This was the most powerful man in the world. He could have asked for any lotion or potion or drug that his people had from anywhere in the world. He could have asked for any sort of masseuse, for a massage to relax him and put him to sleep. He could have had more wine if he wanted. He had a huge harem. He could have had any woman he wanted to come in, help him go to sleep. He had all kinds of options. Why did he ask that the chronicles be come in and read? And why did they just happen to read the page that told about Mordecai saving the king? Why was it that particular page? By the way, what prompted the king to ask if Mordecai had been honored? Why would he ask that? And maybe even more significantly, is what brought Haman in at that exact moment. Exactly when the king said, has Mordecai been honored? And they said no. That's exactly when Haman got there and was ushered into the king to be asked a question about it. Why did it happen at exactly that time? Another line of questions, who told this eunuch Harbona about the gallows? Maybe he was awake all night with the pounding too, we don't know. But how come he knew? How come he knew that that was for Mordecai? Who would have told him that while he was in the king's presence? We don't know how he knew that. How did he know that? We don't know. And why was it this particular servant who happened to be with the king at this moment, the one servant, maybe a lot of them did, but one servant who happened to know all the details about what was going on? Why was he the one that was with the king right at that moment? And by the way, I would ask a question about him. What made him brave enough to suggest that to the king? Oh, by the way, there's a gallows out there. Why don't you hang the guy that's second in command? That's not the kind of question suggestion a servant should make. Why was he brave enough to do that? And the last question, how could all this happen in just 24 hours? The author makes a point that we understand that it all took place in 24 hours. I want to show you a couple phrases. At the first feast of Esther, the first banquet, she said, "Let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them tomorrow." Makes it very clear when that feast is. It's tomorrow. A few verses later, in verse 14, when Haman's wife suggests the gallows, she said, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning have Mordecai hung on it." Notice that the emphasis is we're going to build it now and do it quick, in the morning. Chapter 6, verse 1, on that night the king could not sleep, that very night of the banquet. In chapter 6, verse 4, the king said, "Who's in the court?" Well, Haman is. He came in bright and early because he has a question for you. It's that very next morning. Chapter 6, verse 14. I lost it. Oh, while they were still talking, remember Haman went home and he was bemoaning the fact that he was so embarrassed. While he was still talking, they came and rushed him away to Esther's banquet. Chapter 7, verse 2, on the second day, now that means the second banquet. Remember, she said, come tomorrow for a banquet. He's emphasizing it's really the same 24-hour period. It's just another daylight day. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, it begins, on that very day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman. You see how all the way through here, this author is emphasizing all of this took place in a 24-hour period. That's pretty amazing. How did all of that happen? And why was it the 24 hours between Esther's two banquets? Those are all the coincidences we're talking about. We call them coincidence. The right word is providence. The right word is providence. Providence means God is in control of every situation and every little detail to take care of his people. Another word is sovereignty. God reigns over everything. Providence or sovereignty, that's the right word. I said this whole passage concerns Haman, but it's really all about God. Even without being mentioned, we see all these coincidences taking place. And as the reader, we know that it's the hand of God moving in this situation. Nothing else could explain it. I've called this whole series the Accidental Queen. There's really nothing accidental about it at all. Every detail was put together by God's provident plan. And we see that when it all falls out through this 24-hour period. He is in control of all the details, and that's a God that you can trust. The song has been on the Christian radio the last, year or so, maybe more than that. But it was our countdown this morning. I want to read you these great words. When the solid ground is falling out from underneath my feet, sounds like Mordecai, doesn't it? Between the black skies and my red eyes, I can barely see. When I realize I've been sold out by my friends and my family, sounds like Mordecai and Esther, doesn't it? I can feel the rain reminding me in the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When my hopes and dreams are far from me and I'm running out of faith, I see the future that I picture and it slowly fades away. And when the tears of pain and heartache are pouring down my face, I find my peace in Jesus' name. When the test comes in and the doctor says I've only got a few months left, it's like a bitter pill I'm swallowing. I can hardly take a breath. And when addiction steals my baby girl and there's nothing I can do, my only hope is to trust you. I trust in you. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. It's a lot of storms that have been in our lives. And yet we're reminded by this story that no matter how bad a day may look, God is still in control. What should we do with that? I want to just give you a few quick reminders. I have to give credit where credit's due. Some of these I found in Charles Swindoll's book about the life of Esther, and I thought they were so good I just kind of embellished them for my own. When all seems lost, it isn't. When all seems lost, it isn't. Mordecai's life seemed to be lost. He seemed to be without hope, but God was still in control. And he will act in his time and for his glory. Number 2, when all seems grand, it isn't. When all seems grand, it isn't. Haman seemed to be a grand, powerful person. He thought he was in control. Everybody in town probably thought he was in control as well, but he wasn't as big as he thought, and he wasn't in control. Isaiah quotes Sorry. Isaiah quotes God by saying, I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another or my praise to idols. No matter how great somebody may seem to be or think he is, he's not. Number 3, when reward seems forgotten, it isn't. When reward seems forgotten, it isn't. Mordecai's faithful heroism seemed to be forgotten. But God brought it to light in his time and in his way. And if you've done something heroic and nobody noticed, if you did a good deed that nobody knew about, God sees and God knows. And he brings to light what he needs to bring to light in his time and in his way. He sees and he knows. Number 4, when justice seems ignored, it isn't. When justice seems ignored, it isn't. There's been a lot of injustice in our country come to light in recent years. But God is a God of justice. And he brings everything about in perfect justice in his time. If you have suffered some sort of injustice, God knows, and he will bring about perfect justice in his time. And maybe even a harsher question is, if you have gotten away with some sort of injustice over someone else, God knows. He sees, and he will bring about his perfect justice in his time. Number 5, it might be number 6 in your notes. When confusion seems to reign, it doesn't. When confusion seems to reign, it doesn't. Confusion has seemed to reign for 20 months now, hasn't it? And yet, God is still in control. I have a list of church bulletin bloopers. And one of those is a church bulletin that said, "The Lord God omnipotent resigneth." It's only one letter different than what it should say. The Lord God omnipotent reigneth. But no, he doesn't resign. He still reigns. God may seem to be silent for months or years at a time. He may seem to be inactive for months or years at a time, but he is always at work, working out his perfect plan, his sovereign plan for your life. If you trust in him, you can count on that he's always about doing that. He sees the confusion in our lives, and he says, it's not accidental. We as a congregation have faced a lot of confusion, and I've heard stories even over the last few weeks about some of the crazy things that we've had to deal with as a congregation. Confusion doesn't reign, though. A sovereign God does. And we can put our trust in that. And finally, number 6, it may be 5 in your notes. When God seems absent, he isn't. When God seems absent, he isn't. Just because God is never mentioned in this book doesn't mean he's not there. We see, especially in chapter 6, how God has been at work behind the scenes in everything that's happened. Just when it seems hopeless, sometimes God steps in so that he gets the glory. If you feel like God has abandoned you, he hasn't. He is still there, and he is still active, and he is working out the details for what's good for you and for what's for his greatest glory. He is a sovereign God that's in control, and sometimes we may not know for years what God was doing, but ultimately he will bring about his sovereign best, and we can trust in that. I saw in the news recently that a man named Rochunga Padayati passed away a few years ago. Maybe you don't know who this man is. He was a founder of an organization called Bibles for the World. His story began way back before he was born in 1910. In 1910, a man named Watkin Roberts, in 1905, in fact, Watkin Roberts was saved in the Great Welsh Revival, 1905. And in 1910, he set out for India as a young man to be a missionary. He was kind of an interesting character. He felt called to go where he wasn't supposed to. In those days, the British government controlled everything the missionaries did, where they could go and what they could say. And he felt led to go a place where he couldn't, and he was restricted from doing that, and he hiked into that area anyway. and spent some time with the people in this restricted area, a tribe of headhunters, sharing Christ with them. He was finally kicked out of India after a short time with only a couple of converts in that tribe. One of those was one of the chief men of the tribe. A few years later, that man had a son he named Rochunga. And he shared Christ with his son, Rochunga. And eventually, Rochunga was able to go to the university in India and get trained, and eventually to Britain and then to America. And while he was in America, he found out there was an old missionary named Watkin Roberts living not far from where he was. And he took a train to meet the old missionary who had left India discouraged, wondering why God had called him there. And when he met him, he said, there are hundreds of believers in all the surrounding tribes because of what you shared. The movie about Rochunga's life is called Beyond the Next Mountain. Wonderful movie. That just you see God's hand at work in an amazing way. And in that movie, the old missionary turns around with tears in his eyes and he just says, what an amazing Christ. What an amazing Christ. Sometimes we may not see the details of our lives and what God is doing, but he is always at work, bringing about his glory and our best. We can trust and praise him for that.